Well, it is time once again for a little bit of history and geography. And listen, we started chapter 14 yesterday, section 14.1. By the way, hope you're doing well. And want to get into it right away because we've got a lot of stuff to cover today, and I've got some more stuff you need to do after you've watched the video. So be ready for that. But it talks about your book starts, and you read about this yesterday because I know you read. You said you did. And it talks about the post-war boom. I think I mentioned, if not, should have, that the Great Depression, the reason we got out of the Great Depression was because of World War II. Wars tend to increase the economy. Well, this was a boom after World War II. Things were booming. Things were great. Housing costs went down. Producing goods was better than it ever had been. Distributing them was better than it ever had been. You can imagine by this time we've got the big transfer trucks, and we've got railroads everywhere. We've got airplanes that can carry stuff. We've got great ships that can travel the world quickly. I mean, it was an amazing, amazing time, and it brings us into modern history. Things that you'd never seen in the store before. Stores went to like bigger stores, nice grocery stores, and clothing stores, because you had stuff from all over the world. It was a time that people really started to be able to lay their hands and purchase things that they had never had the opportunity to before. We also saw, as your book mentions, advancements, development of computers comes along, lasers comes along, medical wonders. We talked about, I believe it was the chapter before last, we talked about, because we were still in school, I remember this well, some of y'all were like, the age expectancy for men and women back at the turn of the century. Well, this starts to increase because medical wonders. Years ago, if you had a bad set of tonsils, needed a tonsillectomy, it was rough stuff. And medical wonders bring it to where was not that big of a deal anymore. There was also, and all kind. I just use that as an example: appendicitis, gallbladder, those type of things. Small surgeries that used to be major are starting to become not as big, although surgery is surgery. We had a baby boom. Now, it happened because all of these soldiers come back from war, and here they are, and they start to have kids shortly after they arrive back from the war. And people moved to the big cities. This was a time when cities really start to grow. And a lot of people didn't want to live right in the big city. They lived outside the city. I'll give you a good example: Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham has several suburbs around it, smaller towns that people live, maybe 10 minutes from downtown Birmingham, 15 minutes from downtown Birmingham. And the reason they're able to do so is the availability and the quality of automobiles. You wouldn't want a chance every day riding back and forth from a suburb to Birmingham in a Model T Ford, but we're getting cars by this point, after World War II, that you feel safe. We also see jet airlines where you can travel across the country in no time. Amazing stuff compared to, you think before, when we talked about the Oregon Trail, California Trail, how long it took for them to get out there. Then when you rode by train, how long it would take to get, once Transcontinental Railroad was finished, how long it took to get from one side of the country to the other. Now you hop in an airplane in New York, and within a few hours, you're in California. So we start to see that new technology all over the place. Medical technology, in your book talked about it. One of the big things, Dr. Jonas Salk, you need to remember that name, developed the polio vaccine. Polio was a terrible, terrible disease. Many people had it, and he developed a vaccine. And now with coronavirus in the news, we talk about vaccines today, the importance of them. And polio was one. Much like people are afraid of getting coronavirus, people were afraid of getting polio back then. Jonas Salk came up with that in the early 1950s. We also came up with vaccines for measles, mumps, diphtheria, tetanus. That's where if you step on a nail, rusty nail, cut yourself with something rusty, you can get lockjaw. Y'all would like it if I had lockjaw because I couldn't talk that much. Whooping cough and other diseases. And television. Do y'all like television? I do. I mean, I think it's great if you don't spend too much time with it. But television, we talked about when radio came about, how you could listen to a ball game. I could be in Alabama and I could listen to a ball game coming out of New York or Chicago. And I could hear what this ball game sounded like because I couldn't make it to New York or Chicago to buy a ticket to go to the actual game. I could at least hear it as opposed to just reading about it the next day in the paper. Radio was great for that, but think about television. Now, because of the invention of television, you can watch that ball game that's taking place in another city while it's happening. It was amazing stuff. News became huge. And by the mid-1950s, about 90% of Americans had televisions. Now, these weren't like flat screens like we have now. The picture was not great, but we see them develop. Vacations became popular. Tourism went up, so we know that. Your book talks about that. People started to go to big parks like Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Valley Forge, Gettysburg, Yellowstone. I've been to Yellowstone before. It's beautiful. Long trip out there. But it is beautiful stuff. And people started taking national pride by going to these places that they had heard about their whole lives. But now you have cars, now you have jets, and you can go. After World War II, your book talks about black Americans, well, several groups of Americans, Asians and Hispanics and blacks, all wanting more freedom. And Jackie Robinson, one of the greats. I'm telling you what, this guy was a nice looking guy, and he was just an amazing individual. He really was. Great ball player, a great spokesman for baseball. And Brooklyn Dodgers, that's Brooklyn, New York, before they moved out to Los Angeles. 1947, he became the first black Major League Baseball player. You need to remember him. Jackie Robinson was great. And the thing I want you to understand about Jackie Robinson is when Jackie Robinson played, people would yell things at him, derogatory things, bad things, while he's at the plate, while he's out in the field playing baseball. Only black out there, first black ever in pro baseball. And he just had to take it. You talk about the internal fortitude to be able to withstand and not lash out, not run up and slug somebody, hit somebody, but that internal fortitude to just take it. And he was a milestone achiever for black Americans. And because of him, several are going to eventually become in pro sports. And now we know that there are no racial barriers in pro sports. It's just the best athletes play. But back then, there were a lot of great black American athletes that they wouldn't let play simply because they have more pigment in their skin. It's ridiculous, but that's the way it was. Marian Anderson, I would encourage you, if you want to get on YouTube and look up a video clip of Jackie Robinson, watch him swing the bat a couple of times. Marian Anderson, listen to her sing. Amazing voice, and your book talks about her, one of the greatest opera singers of all time. And I know a lot of you don't like opera. I understand that. But watch her if you get a chance. And I saw something the other day where somebody had dedicated a park to her. I want to say it was in Mississippi. But she was an amazing person. Civil rights movement, desegregation of the schools. In the 1950s and the 60s, they tried to desegregate the schools. There was a civil rights movement, especially in the 60s. And what this was doing, this was going back to the Civil War. We gave a lot of rights to blacks during the Civil War that we didn't follow through on. And the Civil Rights Movement, 100 years after the Civil War, basically, blacks were still trying to get full rights as American citizens. Before that, they had the separate but equal, where you couldn't go to the same school. Black kids couldn't go to where white kids could, and vice versa. But they said that the schools had to be equal. Now we know that they weren't, but that's what they had said. Now you have Brown versus the Board of Education. All children in America could attend school together. Rosa Parks, that has tie-ins to Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama. They made black people sit on the back of the bus. Now there was a reason for that. Not a rational reason, but when you get on a bus, you're going to ride it for a certain distance around a town. You may go 2 or 3 blocks, and then you get off. You pull the little rope, the bus driver knows you need to stop, and you get off. And the reason they made blacks move to the back unfairly was that way they had to walk all the way up and down the bus, and the white folks could sit toward the front and hop off immediately. Rosa Parks refused. She sat on the front of a bus. A white passenger got on there and said, "Hey, you need to move the back." She's like, "No." Big moment in history. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I hope you read about him. If you have never heard his I Have a Dream speech, you need to watch it on YouTube. And it talks about American Indians. It talks about Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans. It talks about Fidel Castro. He is one of the worst, most heinous people of all time. He was a communist dictator of Cuba. And I will at some point talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. If we don't get it in this class, we'll get it in others. But Fidel Castro was a horrible, horrible person and a murderer. It talks about Clarence Thomas. And Clarence Thomas, a black American, a conservative black American on the Supreme Court, one of the greats, and I admire Clarence Thomas a lot. He went through a lot to get there, stuff that we can't even go into in this class, that I wouldn't even go into pretty much with 11th and 12th graders. But Clarence Thomas went through a lot of persecution, a lot of hardship to be able to sit on the Supreme Court. And he's there still today, and one of the greats of all time. So hopefully you read all of that. Very interesting stuff. We're going to get into preserving freedom in an age of big government. We're going to talk tomorrow about the proper role of government. And we're going to run through some presidents. We're going to talk about Ike or Eisenhower. We're going to talk about Kennedy. We're going to talk about Johnson. We're going to talk about Richard Nixon. We're going to talk about Gerald Ford. And we're going to talk about Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was from Plains, Georgia. And he was a peanut farmer who ended up president of the United States. I'm Jimmy Carter. We're going to talk about him tomorrow as well. So we got a lot to cover. I want you to read that next section. It's section 14B. It ends on page 255. It starts on page 250. Now, you don't have to do the comp check today, because this is a long video. You've got some reading to do, but I want you to look at all of the major highlighted terms as you're reading through this and say, okay, Watergate brings down a president. What was Watergate? We'll talk about it tomorrow some, but I want you to read and have some knowledge beforehand. Interesting stuff. Man, I love this stuff. Then we will get into the next day, Ronald Reagan. Ronaldus Maximus, as one radio commentator calls him, the great communicator. We'll talk about him, and then Friday, it's an off day. It's Good Friday. So just a couple more days this week to go. Hang in there. I love y'all, miss y'all, praying for you. Hope you're praying for me too, that we all stay well, and this will be over soon. But read your information, and we will talk tomorrow.